In this episode, we're going to slow down and build a strong foundation for something that confuses a lot of new students. How you decide what really drives risk, and how you choose a risk assessment approach that fits the situation instead of forcing every situation into the same template. Risk work can feel like it should be universal, like there must be one correct way to measure and score everything. But organizations are messy and risk shows up in different shapes. Sometimes you need a fast, high-level view to guide a decision that cannot wait. And sometimes you need a deeper, more defensible analysis because the stakes are high and people will challenge your conclusions. The trick is learning to spot the risk factors that actually move the needle, such as exposure, criticality, change, and dependency, and then selecting an assessment style that matches your purpose and your available information. By the end, you should be able to explain what risk factors are in plain language, describe several common assessment approaches, and justify why one approach is better than another in a given scenario. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A risk factor is any condition that tends to increase or decrease the chance that something harmful will happen, or increase or decrease how bad the harm would be if it did happen. Beginners sometimes treat risk factors as a big grab bag of anything that sounds security-related, but risk factors are most useful when they help you predict or explain outcomes. For example, an externally reachable service has different risk than an internal-only service, even if both run the same software, because exposure changes opportunity. A system that supports payroll on payday carries different impact than a test system used for learning, even if both have the same technical weaknesses, because business criticality changes consequences. A process that changes frequently tends to create more risk than one that is stable, because change introduces mistakes and surprises. When you can name risk factors clearly, you stop arguing about vague fear and start talking about observable conditions that can be measured, compared, and improved. Before choosing an assessment approach, it helps to understand that risk is not just a property of technology. It is the relationship between something valuable, something that can go wrong, and the environment that makes the harm more or less likely. That environment includes people, processes, and dependencies, not just software. A common beginner misunderstanding is assuming the most technical system is automatically the highest risk, when in reality the highest risk is often the system that is most depended upon, most exposed, and least recoverable. Another misunderstanding is focusing on rare, dramatic events while ignoring common, smaller failures that happen repeatedly and add up to major cost and disruption over time. Risk factors keep you honest by pulling you back to what is likely and what is impactful in your specific organization. They also help you explain why you prioritized one concern over another, because you can point to factors like reachability, data sensitivity, operational importance, or reliance on a single vendor. One major family of risk factors relates to exposure, which is how reachable an asset or process is by people who might misuse it or by conditions that could disrupt it. Exposure is not only about the public internet, even though that is an obvious example, because exposure also includes broad internal access, third-party access, and automated connections between systems. If many people can reach a system and the access is hard to monitor, the likelihood of misuse or mistake goes up. If a service is used by external customers or partners, any weakness can be stressed at scale, and the impact of downtime can become more visible and more damaging to trust. Exposure also includes how easy it is for failures to spread, such as when systems are tightly coupled and share credentials or data flows. When you identify exposure factors early, you can choose an assessment approach that pays attention to boundaries, access paths, and blast radius, rather than one that only lists technical weaknesses without context. Another major family of risk factors relates to impact, meaning how much harm occurs when a failure happens. Impact is shaped by business criticality, data sensitivity, legal obligations, safety concerns, and reputational expectations, and it can vary dramatically even inside the same organization. A system supporting emergency operations carries different impact than a convenience tool, and that difference should change how you assess and how you prioritize. Impact also depends on recoverability, because a system that can be restored quickly has lower operational impact than a system that is hard to rebuild or has poorly tested recovery processes. Dependency chains matter here as well, because the impact of one failure can multiply when many processes rely on the same underlying service. Beginners often underestimate impact because they focus on the immediate technical effect, like a server crash, instead of the downstream consequences, like missed services, delayed decisions, and cascading failures. When impact factors are clear, you can choose an assessment approach that emphasizes scenario consequences, not just vulnerability counts. Change is a risk factor that deserves special attention, because change is one of the most consistent predictors of incidents in real environments. When systems change frequently, there are more opportunities for misconfiguration, misunderstood requirements, rushed testing, and unintended side effects. Change can be technical, like new features or infrastructure migration, but it can also be organizational, like staff turnover, vendor transitions, or restructuring of responsibilities. A stable system with mature processes can still carry risk, but frequent change tends to raise both likelihood and uncertainty, because you have less confidence that controls remain correctly applied. This is also where the concept of complexity matters, because complex environments make it harder for people to understand cause and effect, which increases the chance of mistakes and slows response when something breaks. When change and complexity are high, assessment approaches that rely on perfect, static documentation tend to fail, so you may favor approaches that include verification, observation, and scenario reasoning. Control strength and control reliability are also risk factors, and beginners should understand that controls are not simply present or absent. A control can exist but be inconsistently followed, poorly understood, or dependent on a single person, which makes it fragile. Control strength includes design, like whether access rules are meaningful, but it also includes operation, like whether access changes are reviewed and whether exceptions are managed with discipline. Control reliability is influenced by training, workload, clarity of responsibility, and how well controls fit normal workflows. A control that conflicts with how people actually work will be bypassed under pressure, which means it provides less protection than it appears to provide on paper. This is why a risk assessment approach must consider not only what controls are supposed to do, but whether they are likely to work when the organization is stressed. When control reliability is uncertain, a stronger assessment approach may require evidence and operational signals rather than simple statements of intent. Now we can talk about choosing the right assessment approach, and the first decision is what question you are trying to answer. Sometimes you need a comparative view across many assets to decide where to focus attention, and sometimes you need a deeper analysis of one critical scenario to support a high-stakes decision. A broad, qualitative assessment can be useful when you need speed and coverage, like building an initial risk register or sorting a large portfolio into priority tiers. A more detailed, scenario-based assessment becomes useful when you must justify investment, select between treatment options, or defend your conclusions to oversight groups. Beginners often feel pressure to make every assessment deeply quantitative, but that is not always realistic or necessary, especially when data quality is low. The real skill is matching approach to purpose, because the wrong approach wastes time and can create false confidence. A lightweight approach can be honest and useful when it clearly states assumptions, while a heavy approach can be misleading if it pretends to be precise without reliable inputs. One common assessment approach is qualitative ranking, where you describe likelihood and impact using categories like low, medium, and high, then combine those categories to prioritize. This approach is popular because it is fast, easy to communicate, and adaptable across many domains, which makes it useful for enterprise-level comparisons. Its weakness is that categories can become subjective if definitions are unclear, and two people can rate the same scenario differently based on experience or bias. To make qualitative ranking more reliable, you need consistent definitions tied to your organization's reality, such as what qualifies as high impact in terms of downtime or data exposure, and what qualifies as high likelihood in terms of exposure and known weaknesses. Qualitative approaches also benefit from capturing confidence, because some ratings are backed by strong evidence while others are educated guesses. Beginners should see qualitative ranking as a tool for triage and communication, not as a final answer for decisions that require strong defensibility. Another approach is semi-quantitative scoring, where you still use categories, but you assign numbers to create more granularity and to support comparisons across many risks. This can help reduce ambiguity when you have many items clustered around the same qualitative rating, and it can encourage consistency if scoring guidance is well designed. The danger is that numbers can create an illusion of precision, making people think a risk scored 72 is meaningfully different from a risk scored 70, even if both scores are based on rough judgments. Semi-quantitative scoring works best when it is treated as a structured way to capture reasoning, not as a scientific measurement. It also works best when you keep the model simple enough that people can explain why the score is what it is, because unexplained scoring becomes a black box that decision-makers do not trust. When you choose this approach, you should ensure the underlying risk factors, like exposure and criticality, are explicitly represented rather than hidden. A scenario-based approach is particularly valuable when you need to connect risk to real outcomes and to real decisions, because it forces you to describe how harm would occur and what it would look like. Instead of saying a system is risky because it has weaknesses, you describe a plausible event path, such as unauthorized access leading to misuse of sensitive data, or a vendor outage leading to service disruption beyond tolerance. Scenario-based assessments help beginners avoid the trap of counting issues without understanding consequences, because the scenario naturally highlights what matters: who is affected, how quickly damage spreads, and how hard recovery would be. This approach also supports selecting controls and treatments because you can map controls to specific points in the event path, like prevention, detection, and recovery. Scenario-based work takes more time than simple scoring, so it is often reserved for the highest priority risks, the most critical services, and decisions where leadership needs clear, persuasive reasoning. When stakes are high, scenario clarity tends to persuade better than abstract scores. A portfolio approach is useful when the organization needs a big-picture view, and it focuses on grouping risks and identifying patterns across many assets, teams, or vendors. Instead of treating every item as unique, you look for common drivers, like repeated dependency on a single provider, repeated weaknesses in access governance, or repeated problems caused by rapid change. This approach helps you choose systemic improvements that reduce many risks at once, which is often more effective than fixing the same problem in many places separately. Portfolio assessment also helps highlight concentration and dependency risk, because it reveals when many critical functions rely on the same underlying service. Beginners should understand that this approach shifts the question from which single system is riskiest to which risk themes create the most enterprise exposure. It is especially helpful for planning and budgeting because it supports investments that improve resilience broadly. When used well, it prevents the organization from playing a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. Choosing the right approach also depends on the quality of your inputs, because an assessment is only as defensible as the information it is built on. If asset inventories are incomplete, if ownership is unclear, or if control evidence is weak, a highly detailed model will not magically produce good results. In those situations, the right approach may emphasize improving inputs first, capturing uncertainty, and using qualitative or scenario methods that remain honest about what is known and unknown. Conversely, when you have strong operational data, stable definitions, and reliable evidence, you can use more structured comparisons and produce results that stand up better to scrutiny. Beginners often feel they must hide uncertainty to look competent, but the opposite is usually true. Clearly stating assumptions and confidence levels tends to increase trust. A good approach makes uncertainty visible so it can be reduced over time through better inventory, better monitoring, and better verification. That is how risk assessment matures from opinion to evidence-based decision support. To conclude, identifying risk factors and picking the right risk assessment approach is about matching the method to the purpose while staying grounded in the conditions that actually shape likelihood and impact. Risk factors like exposure, criticality, change, dependency, and control reliability help you explain why some scenarios matter more than others and why some conclusions are more confident than others. Assessment approaches range from qualitative ranking for fast triage, to semi-quantitative scoring for structured comparison, to scenario-based analysis for high-stakes decisions, to portfolio views that reveal enterprise patterns and concentration risk. The right choice depends on what decision needs to be made, how much time you have, and how strong your inputs and evidence are, and it should always include clear assumptions rather than pretending to be perfectly precise. When you can look at a situation, identify the factors that drive risk, and justify an assessment style that fits the stakes, you move from doing risk as paperwork to doing risk as thoughtful, defensible judgment. That capability is what makes risk management useful to the organization and trustworthy to decision makers.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.